I can't get back far enough.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first meeting of the Historical Society for this year. And I must congratulate you people. You've done a great job. You're really moving ahead here with your pictures and your storage and what have you. Tonight we are going to have a panel here. Each person will have from 7 to 10 minutes to speak, and then at the end of the session, there can be questions from the floor. When I was by the way, my name is Mary Duchuk, but most of you may know me by Mary O'Donnell, and some of you may even know me by Mary Spencer. I've been around this little village for most of my life and feel a real part of it, as most of us do, I think. And when I was growing up, we didn't have televisions or anything, so we listened to the radio. And one thing I remember, one program on the radio that I remembered especially was, I think, Tuesday night. And it was stories from the Naked City. The Naked City being New York, of course. And I remember that they always started out with, there are 7 million stories in the Naked City, and this is one of them. Now, we don't have 7 million stories from Lakefield, I don't think, although we might come close. But we do have a number of interesting people who were part of the growth of this little village. They were very diverse. Even the people we've heard about tonight were all different. And they all brought their own talents and their own special interests to benefit the whole village. Tonight we're going to start with Helen Northey. Or, by the way, the person we're speaking about tonight is Mr. Harry Hill and his wife Eva. Now, Helen Northey, who's at this end of the panel, far end of the panel there, Helen, would you stand up, please? Helen is going to tell us about Uncle Harry as a member of her family, and she's going to have some help from her sister Shirley. Then the next person to speak will be Mr. Dan Armstrong. Up, Dan. Oh. And he's going to talk about Harry as a neighbor, because they were neighbors, very good neighbors too. And then John Millage will give us some history of Harry's occupation here as clerk of the village. And then Neil Wasson will tell us something about Harry as a friend. So without any further ado, we'll turn it over now to Helen and Shirley. Thank you.
Neil says we don't have to stand, so. Okay, my name's Shirley Robinson. I'm Helen's sister. Anyways, Helen asked me if I would come and read this for her because she has a bit of a problem of seeing. So she asked me just before dinner tonight, so I just noticed that she is, and she's not even reading it. Okay, she says, hello, my name is Helen Northey Hill. Uncle Harry was my father's youngest brother of 8 children. He also had a sister called Eva. She married Mel Kingdon, Mel's first wife. Now, they had a daughter, Sherry Darling, and she lives in Lakefield. My father was a lock master. He drowned 6 weeks before I was born, chipping ice off the lock. Uncle Harry's mother was bedridden and paralyzed in both feet from a stroke. And I only remember my grandma in bed or a wheelchair. She was like that for 15 years. The 2 brothers still at home worked away, one in Frankfurt, the other in Peterborough. Uncle Harry was left the job of looking after her and her medication. I remember before Christmas, Tanner's drugstore had a contest. When you bought something, you could vote. When you bought something, you could vote for someone. One of the prizes was a doll. I looked at it every day, but never had hoped to win it. Then, the day before Christmas, my sister said, come on, we have to go to the drugstore. I had won the doll. When Uncle Harry picked up Grandma's medications, he voted for me. That was 3/4 of my votes. I never forgot that day, or Uncle Harry for his kindness. Uncle Harry was a teacher, but chose the job as village clerk so he could look after Grandma. Uncle Harry joined the army a while after my brothers, who joined at the same time. That was Jiggs and Jock, and Gordon and Sherman. They were not stationed far from Uncle Harry overseas when my brother Jock was killed. He was there with Jiggs. My other brother, he was there with Jiggs. My other brother, thank you, Uncle Harry, for being there. When Harry came home, he took back the job as village clerk from Elwood Northey, who was Butts Northey. I can still see him walking down the street, newspaper under his arm. Once in a while, he would slap it on his leg. A little while back, I was talking to Elgin Peters as as an Apsley clerk. He told me if he needed to know anything about township, village, or county, he would ask the clerk in Lakefield. He didn't need to look it up in a book. That was Uncle Harry. Over at the telephone office, Eva Hendren was the operator and manager. None of us knew they were even seeing each other until Uncle Harry told us they were married. The only ones that knew were Grace Young and Frank Payne, who stood up for them. Uncle Harry sure could keep a secret. He had a mind of his own, and that's a thing that goes with being a Hill. I vouch for that. I didn't even know he could paddle a canoe until I saw him dressed in a suit and tie in his canoe with Aunt Eva on a tape at Aunt Eva's funeral. That was Uncle Harry. Harry loved dogs and flowers, and of course Aunt Eva. They had the most beautiful garden and yard. Aunt Eva and Uncle Harry were well matched. Aunt Eva was a lovely, prim, and proper lady, and as Mel Kingdon said, Aunt Eva had lunch on the table ready for Uncle Harry when the village lunch bell rang. He sat down. I didn't make it to his funeral, but memories are still with me. After Uncle Harry died, my sister Shirley and I went to visit Aunt Eva for her birthday. If I remember, she bought a huge big cake, and she thought everybody was going to come, and Denise and Helen and I were the only ones, and Grace were the only ones that went to see her that day. I think it was a special birthday. She was so happy to see us. Shortly after, she went to the nursing home. I seen her every Armistice Day and visited when I could. She was still the prim and proper lady until she died. And it wasn't until my last visit she told me I was Uncle Harry's favorite niece. So left that out. Uncle Harry could not have chosen a better person than Eva Hendren to be his wife. We are proud and happy to have an aunt and uncle like Harry and Eva Hill. Thank you.
Okay, now our next panelist, thank you very much, Shirley, and Helen as well. That was well done. Our next panelist, Mr. Dan Armstrong, as a neighbor.
Before I start, I just want to let you know that Neil Wasson hasn't changed one bit since Kevin Heffernan and Morrissey and I and whoever went to school with him. Is that I don't know. Some of mine will be a little bit of repetition from Grace and Shirley's presentation. Harry T. Hill was born in Lakefield in 1906. He was the son of Wellington Hill and Rachel Crowe, who came from Dummer. He was raised in the little white house at the corner of Clementi and Danecourt Street. I hope I have this right. He appeared in the 1911 census as Henry Hill. He had 6 brothers: Roland, Sherman, who was Helen Northey and Shirley's father, Frank, Richard, Percy, and Darcy, who was Loretta Archer's father. And as they had mentioned, he had one sister, Eva, who was a teacher, and she married Mel Kingdon, and Eva was the mother of Ron and Helen, or Sherry Darling. And I didn't know till a couple of months ago that we always called her Sherry. Now I guess she's come back to Helen. Okay. Eva T. Hill was born in 1913 in the second house from Millich's Plumbing on Reed Street. The village taxi occupied the building at one time. Eva was the daughter of John Jack Hendren and Annie McBurney. She had 4 brothers: Roy, William, Bill, Jack, and George, and one sister, Vera Whittle. Roy, Bill, and Jack moved to British Columbia. You just have to bear with me here. I've been a typical teacher. I didn't have my notes already here. Okay. Yeah. After the war, Harry and Eva resumed their courtship. I guess as you had mentioned that they had gone together before. They were married in 1948 right in this very church here, St. John's Anglican. Grace Young and Frank Payne were the attendants. They commenced building their new home at 45 Bridge Street. Eva lived there, I think, until 2004, and Harry died in 1975. Eva died in 2008 at Extendicare Lakefield. Harry and Eva cared for Eva's mother and Harry's aunt, Mrs. Cuff, for several years. Eva and Harry were founding members of the Lakefield Horticulture Society. Harry was a 50-year member of Clementi Masonic Lodge in Lakefield, and Eva was a life member of the United Church, the UCW of Lakefield United Church. And as Helen had mentioned, Eva was very famous for her flower garden, and I remember as a child they had a very large vegetable garden, and they always shared their produce from the garden with all the neighbors on Nelson and Bridge Street. So that's one thing I can remember. And as I said, they were just great people. They never differentiated, and they did really help many people in the village. People don't really realize how much they did for what we call today the down and out. So thank you very much.
Eva was also quite a notable painter. She did many beautiful paintings as well. Our next speaker, thanks Dan, our next speaker will be John Milledge, and he's the one that worked with Harry and knew all his inner secrets.
John, before you start, the bat was only good for an hour, okay?
Something else.
Lakefield, and I always knew of Harry Hill from stories that were around, and I was always kind of leery because I was told that at the town hall in Lakefield there was Harry Hill, there was Garnet Samus, and a number of others that if they got a hold of you, you were in trouble. In 1967, I was working in Toronto, and a friend of mine where I worked was reading the Globe and Mail and saw an ad for an assistant clerk and treasurer for the village of Lakefield. So he pointed it out to me and he said, you should go for that. My wife and I had just been married just a couple months before that, and she didn't particularly like Toronto, so I sat down and I put in an application, not thinking that I would even get a reply, but I did. And I ended up coming to Lakefield and having an interview. And that's the first time I actually met Harry Hill, and I found out very quickly that he was a very personable and very caring and wonderful man. I got the job, and on November 22nd, 1967, I walked in the front door. And I can tell you, without a word of a lie, that the next few years were the most entertaining and the most informative time of my life, and I'm talking about before or since, because everything went on there. Everything in the village of Lakefield and in the surrounding area ended up in the Lakefield Town Hall. Harry, where do I start here? It's already been mentioned about his flowers and all the other stuff. Harry, as Dan said, was a very benevolent individual. There's a lot of people in the village that didn't really particularly like him. And I never could figure out why they didn't like him, because I always liked him. Now, he didn't always talk to you, but then when he did talk, he talked for a very long time, and he told you things that about the village and about the history of the village that made me very interested in the history of the village. As was mentioned, he told me stories about when he was overseas, and he didn't talk about it very much, but when he did talk, he shared the time that I do remember when he was with the Canadians at Filet, when the American bombers bombed the Canadians. He was there. He never talked about that. He never talked about the numbers of times that he helped people when they were down and out. He looked after people like Cephas Little, that a lot of us will remember.
Was he the bottom lad?
think so.
Yeah, bottle amongst other things.
Okay, thank you.
Stan Windsor, you might remember Stan
Yeah.
Windsor in his later days. Harry made sure that he had a place to stay when not very many other people would. Harry was always telling me stories, as I said, about things. And what I most enjoyed about the stories were, I knew they were absolutely true, because I had no way of discerning whether they were true or not, so I took them all to be true. Harry was very kind, but he was also very mischievous. And I remember one time he came in and he said, "I'm having some fun with the post office." And it seems that there was a family on Highway 36 between Buckhorn and Burley Falls. And the man's name was Harry Hill.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there was mail come to the post office, and like anybody would take it back in, he would, you remember in the old post office, you used to go to the front of the post and pull the thing down. Well, he wouldn't take it in. He kept getting this same thing over and over again, but he would take it and put it in to the outside box, and they'd have to process it again. Anyways, where do I start? Where do I finish? What do I talk on?
Oh, keep going.
Harry and Eva, I went over to their house many times. Eva was, as the lady said, she was a fine lady too. She was always interested in everything that was going on. She didn't come to the office in the town hall very often, but when she came, that was about the only time that he paid attention. He really did. I remember when my wife had our first son, that was in 1968. There were flowers in the hospital. She did with no card on them. And they were brought in by Harry. I found that out a couple days later because I asked him and he said, yes, I did. I can't think of any, like I could go on here for 2 or 3 hours, but I can't tell you so many things. I will tell you one thing that I do remember though. There were people by the name of Souls that lived down the street from us on the corner of Albert and Reed Street. And a lot of you might remember the young girl named Ellen Souls.
Yeah.
When she was growing up and going to school at the old school, the teacher asked her who the Prime Minister of Canada was one day, and she said Harry Hill. And we can't forget Lance. And Helen, you'll remember, we used to have in the office, Percy would come in and have a visit, and then Frank would come down on the school bus from the Cavendish Mills, and they'd all get together and have a big chat. But Harry never had time to talk to them. They were on their own when they came to Lakefield. The last time I talked to Harry Hill was after I went to work in Harvey Township in 1975, and I went to visit him. And he said, "How are you doing?" I said, "I'm doing really well. How are you?" He said, "I'm not long for this world." And he was very ill. And I can tell you today that I spent almost 40 years in the municipal business. And he never taught me anything about the municipal business, but he really, really taught me about how to deal with people, how to know how to deal with people, how to be fair, how to be equitable, and all that sort of thing. Now, Eva was another gem of the village, and she was always kind, and I know she was always kind to me. And one time I remember Harry came into the office one day, it was a Thursday after lunch, and he said, "I'm going to be away for 2 weeks." And I said, "Oh, where are you going?" He said, "I'm taking my wife and we're going to visit Jack in British Columbia. I just came from Peterborough and I bought the tickets for the train." I said, "Well, I'm sure she's going to enjoy that." He said, "She doesn't know yet, I haven't told her." He said, "Well, I think you should tell her." And he said, "Well, she'd only drive herself crazy getting ready." So, thanks, folks.
Thanks, John. You certainly knew Harry better than most of us did, I think. Thank you very much. Our next speaker will be Neil Lawson. Got a hard act to follow here, Neil.
I guess I could crouch. I don't know whether you're supposed to sit up or stand down. But
You can stand
anyhow,
on your
I
head.
wanted to say that I don't know this Harry and Eva Hill at all, but I couldn't resist the opportunity to get up in front of you. But I have learned from Helen and Shirley, and from Dan and John and Mary, that he's somebody you should sit up and pay attention to. I did know Harry Hill pretty well, and he was certainly a favorite of mine. When I look back at municipal politics and municipal affairs, from all the years, he is my hero. He was a wonderful man, and he did so much for Lakefield and wanted so little recognition that he just, we should all be thankful. He was my hero, my all-time fan. If Harry were here tonight, he wouldn't be very happy. I can guarantee you. He didn't like recognition. He didn't like praise. He just liked to trudge along and do his job, and he wouldn't have been any part of any of this paying tribute or homage to Harry. That was one of his ideal traits. Harry had multiple jobs. Like, it's hard to imagine the number of jobs that he had. If he were in today's municipal endeavors, each and every one of the jobs he had would have a personal secretary and 1 or 2 employees to help. He was clerk treasurer. He was the assessor. He was the welfare administrator. He was the electoral officer. He was secretary of Hillside Cemetery. He was secretary of the Hydro Commission in Lakefield until they hired Doris Jackman.
Yeah.
No,
Dunford.
Doris, she was Jackman, but she married John Dunford. He did all of those things, and he did them all himself. And he didn't have any help, and he didn't have any secretaries, and he didn't have any computers. He just had Harry. And Harry had us. I was a member of the Lakefield Council from 1966 to 1970. And I like to think that we were good and honest men. And indeed we were men, because there were no ladies on the council then. That was almost taboo and unheard of. I think Charlotte Wetton might have been in Ottawa, but she wasn't in Lakefield. But we were certainly quite inexperienced. And we didn't know anything about municipal affairs, about municipal law, or the proper procedure. Harry took us by the hand, like our dear teacher, Miss Elsie Kidd, had a few years previously, and walked us through the kindergarten of municipal affairs. And he knew everything, and he could guide it, and he knew what you could do as a corporation, and what you couldn't do, and what you should be wary of, and what you shouldn't be. And he was just wonderful. He was just a tremendous help to a bunch of councillors. And every couple years, he had to train about 2/3 of the council in the same way. And he led them, and he led by example. Harry was a World War II veteran. He was always interested in helping people. One of the Lakefield boys, Jim Crow, was in the Royal Canadian Air Force, and he was killed. And he was washed up in the shore, and I'm sorry, I could have looked it up because he was a first cousin of my mother's. But anyway, I think it was in Holland, and he was buried in Holland. Now, if you were a soldier in Europe in the Second World War and you got to leave, you know, all those Dutch girls and all that, they had 100 things you could have done. What did Harry do? He went and he inspected where Jim Crow was buried. He took photos of the grave. He marked down what was written on the tombstone. He brought that home, and Jim was adopted by Lona and Bill Gray. And he came home and he presented all those photos and told them all the story of Jim, and they were so relieved to find where he was buried and so on. That was Harry Hill. Nothing to do with municipal politics, just a good person. I'd like to tell you a little story about small town politics. When I was on council, we hired a police officer from Lindsay. And he served with us for 3 days, and what happened, I don't know, but he quit. So we wanted to get a policeman. Well, I had a good friend who I have tremendous respect for, who had always been, he kept me out of jail, and that was quite a chore. Constable Garnet Samus. He was a wonderful man. He had left the Lakefield Police Force, and he had gone down to Eastern Ontario, Napanee, Bath area, and like many of us has met one time or another, life wasn't too kind to him, and he wanted a job, and he wanted to get back to Lakefield where he felt loved and appreciated, and I wanted him back in Lakefield. But there were other members of the council who had different opinions. And I'm giving you this little exercise in small town politics, and I imagine this big town politics, it's all over. Anyway, I went and I talked with my good friend Harry Hill. Well, you know, he said, G. Winder Smith was a very good friend of Garnet Samus. And he's the headmaster at the Lakefield Grove School, and he'll give you a letter. He said, also, one of our counselors, George Brown, is in charge of the cadets, Navy cadets at the Grove School, and George would be swayed by any thoughts that G. Winder Smith had. I said, oh, that's good to know. So I went and saw G. Winder Smith, and G. Winder looked after in excellent thing. And then Harry said, you know, Bill Grant always really appreciated Garnet Samus. And I'm sure that Bill Grant would also give a letter. And I went and saw Bill Grant. And Bill Grant gave a letter, and Bill of recommendation. And Bill also knew a few people on council. And he was our village solicitor. And I mean, he had the law on his side. So then one of the gentlemen on the council, and a very fine gentleman, but he didn't particularly care for Garnet Samus, and he didn't want him back here. And he said it would be over his dead body if Garnet Samus ever come back. Well, this same gentleman, who I loved and respected very much, went on a deer hunt. And he used to hunt. He used to hunt for 2 weeks, and then he was a couple days going, a couple days coming back. So I had an 18-day window there. When he was hunting, I hired Garnet. And I was the chairman of the police committee, and I hired Garnet. Now, I was so glad when I saw the gentleman and a good friend of mine come back from the hunt that he wasn't a dead body. He was fine, he was healthy, and everything was good. That was the story with how Garnet came back the second year. Second time to Lakefield, much under the promotion of, Incidentally, Garnet Samus was just the best friend for a 15 or 20 year period that anybody growing up in Lakefield could have. He knew a criminal when he saw one. He never saw one in Lakefield. Finally, I want to share you a story which will tell you about Harry Hill. I just explained to you all the jobs he had, and he had many. So Neil was a counselor in there, and he thought, gee, doesn't seem to be making much money as far as I'm concerned. I'm one of the poorest paid guys in the insurance industry, and I make more money than him. So I brought up a motion that Harry was making either $3,500 or $4,500 in 1966, and I said, this is ridiculous for all the work he has, and we should bring his level of salary up equal to that which all the other clerk treasurers in the county get, and so on, which was another $2,000 or $3,000 more. So I made a very eloquent speech, well rehearsed in council, and it was endorsed and everything else. And Harry said, well, he said, Eva and I have a very comfortable lifestyle. We enjoy what we're doing. I feel that I'm adequately paid, and I don't want to raise. And so if you can ever imagine this day and age, now we weren't going to load them up with a tax problem, I can guarantee you that. I mean, this was Lakefield. But we were going to get, no, he didn't want it, so we didn't give him one. All told, I remember Eva when she was a young single girl, and she lived with her husband on Reed Street pardon me, not her husband, with her father, Jack Hendren, who was one of the many Hendren family. He was a brother to George the Undertaker, Jim, who was Wallace's father. Many of you knew Wallace, and I used to ride around him, and he was a jitney, and we called him Jitney Jack, and which meant that he hauled freight and luggage around town and forever. And when you worked with him, at the end of the day, he'd give you a sunburned quarter, which was one of those big coppers. So Eva, God bless her, she was a wonderful lady, and always a lady. She certainly learned how to manage money. Thank you. Harry didn't need the raise.
Thanks, Neil. And I want to express a real vote of thanks for our entire panel. I think they've done a wonderful job. How about it?
Are you going to speak, Mary?
I think I've said enough. I think we'll have time now for,
I forgot something.
what did you forget?
Oh,
That's not unusual.
Oh, I know,
You forget.
I forgot to tell you, Eva worked at Spence's store with my sister Dorothy, and to show you how kind Eva was, you all knew Tommy Sullivan. Tommy had a big family, and Tommy oftentimes had it hard. And Bernie Johnson was in the store at the time too, but Tommy would get in and he'd say, Eva, only got, he'd come up with 50 cents or whatever it would be, and of course that wouldn't near pay the. So Eva would give him credit, but she'd just put paid on the bill. My sister told me that, just to show you how kind that Eva was. Also, I forgot to mention that Harry had looked after his brother Frank for several years, didn't he, up at Ketchakoma. And I said I wasn't going to tell any stories, but this gentleman had mentioned Cephas Little. This is a true story, Harry told me. At Christmas, they would always prepare Christmas dinners for all the old bachelors in Lakefield that needed it. So Harry had taken the Christmas dinner up to Cephas Little and lived up on Strickland Street. And she had the turkey, and she had the gravy, and the cranberries, and the whole bit, and the plum pudding with the brandy sauce. So I knew that was okay, so Harry went up later on to pick up the dishes. And he said, how was everything, Cephas? And he said, well, you can go and tell your wife, he said, that plum sauce was too greasy and that gravy was too sweet.
Well, now it's the turn of the audience here, and you can ask some questions too. That I think these people have done a wonderful job of covering things, but there may be a few other things that you might like to ask them about, and now it's your turn. Mary.
John, who took over Harry's job when he retired, and what year was that again that he retired?
I believe it was 1971, could have been 72. And the man's name was Alan Hancock, and he was from Timmins. He was here for about 2 years, and then Earl Cuddy came. You probably all remember Earl. I was there till 1974 when I went to Harvey Township. Harry retired, I think it was in 71, 72. Wanted to mention something. Neil was talking about Harry and what he did. In 1937, I believe it was, when Harry first went to work for the village of Lakefield, he told me one time that he was appointed by the council as acting building inspector. And when he retired in 1971, he told me he was still acting building inspector.
Just one thing about treasurer clerks, and John will probably confirm this, don't put the heat on. But the townships are really run by the clerk treasurers. I was on Dummer Council for a few years, and I certainly learned that. And one of the great examples was the first clerk of Dummer Township was a fellow by the name of Arundel Hill, who ran things exactly as he wanted to. Not only that, in one vote, there was a councillor he didn't like, so he wouldn't swear him in, and the guy sat for a year. He couldn't sit on council. That was the clerk and the power that he had. So they do run the township, and after all, they're the ones that are there permanently. The politicians come and go.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Are there more questions from the audience?
Could I make a comment to Neil? Neil was talking about the lack of female counselors. Just as a matter of interest, my mother was the first female counselor in the village of Lakefield.
Thank you. Yeah, Marjorie Welford was the first female counselor in Lakefield.
What year?
Within the 60s. Would be in the late 50s, 60s. Early 60s.
Somewhere in there.
In 1966, the first ballpark, the one that used to be beside the arena, It was declared by bylaw as a playing field by the council under the old, what they used to call the Community Centres Act. And the Lakefield Lions Club put up the money to put the lights on it. And Harry, they applied for a grant under the Community Centres Act, and the amount that they received at that time was, I think, $4,300 towards this ballpark and the lighting. And a far cry from what North Kawartha Township, they got $9 million just to build an arena. But anyways, they had a photo opportunity, and the then member of Parliament, I think it was, I can't remember who it was, but they had a great big photo op of him handing over the check to the reeve of the village and whoever that was at that time. But the problem was there was no check in it. It was just a photo op. The check never came for 4 months.
You were husband that next day. We had a hand up over here a while
I'd
ago.
ask John to tell him about the widow who lived across from the town hall.
Oh, yes. Annie Kemp and Herb, her husband Herb, lived in the house. I believe it's where the treasure chest is now. And if anybody remembers the way the town hall was laid out, you come in the front door, and there was a big room, and then Harry had a little cubby hole. And Herb had died quite a few years earlier, and Mrs. Kemp was still living in the house. But she had, I guess what you'd call today Alzheimer's. She wasn't very well. And one day I was sitting in what I call the big room, and she came in through the front door, and she had an umbrella, and she slammed the umbrella down on the counter and yelled, "Mr. Hill." And of course he saw her through the window, and he come around, and he was always very gracious. "Yes, Mrs. Kemp." "Yes, Mrs. Kemp." Now remember, Harry was the secretary of the Lakefield Cemetery. I think Neil mentioned Hillside, but Lakefield Cemetery. And she said, "Mr. Hill, I want you to go out to the cemetery and tell that fella out there to quit digging Herb up every time I go out to see him." He said, "He's got him dug up and put in a different place." And without missing a beat, Harry said, "Yes, Mrs. Kemp." He said, "I got to go out there right after lunch, and I'll make sure that he gets the message."
Never the diplomat.
Harry also told me another story I think I can mention. I won't mention names, but there was a young fellow working down at the, that would read the meters. And of course in those days, I guess the meters were in the basement. So they had to go down in. So this young lad went to this certain place, and this elderly lady and her daughter were there. And he rapped on the door and told them what he was about. And she said, "Oh no," she said, "you can't come in here." She said, "You know, I have a young eligible daughter." And the daughter at that time, I suppose, would have been maybe 60. So the fellow went back to Harry, and he said, "This lady won't let me in. What am I going to do?" So anyway, Harry said, "It's okay, I'll go back up with you." So he went on up to the house, and he knocked at the door, and he said, "Mrs. So-and-so, it's okay now. This fella has to read the meter." And she said, "Well, that's okay, Harry." She said, "You sit with my daughter, and I'll go down with him and let him read the meter."
We're talking about Tommy Sullivan. I can remember the story. They had the house in behind Fred Hudson's used furniture over here, and poor Mrs. Sullivan in the house there, and Ray and all the kids to look after, and they didn't have any hydro. So Fred felt sorry for Mrs. Sullivan trying to do the laundry and everything, so he run an extension cord over so Mrs. Sullivan could get this old wringer washer going, and that was fine. And but one day the hydro went off, and the story around the blacksmith shop was that Tommy was the first in Harry's office complaining because there was no hydro.
Harry and Eva started the Lakefield Horticultural Society And of course, that was before what I still refer to as the new bridge. It was built in 1972. And a lot of you will remember the old cement bridge that was there, the blacksmith shop beside it. And Harry told me the story about it was a county bridge at that time, and what the county used to do was they pass a bylaw to repair a bridge or to rebuild a bridge. And they had done that for Buckhorn. They were going to build a bridge in Buckhorn. Okay, so anyways, what had happened was the contract had been actually let. There were some houses purchased next to the bridge, where the bridge was going to be in Buckhorn, but through local politics, as Neil was talking about earlier, there was a move from some of the local politicians to make a change. And the contract, I say, was let, and just let me just get my memory on straight. But the county council was persuaded to make a change, and they changed their mind about the one in Buckhorn, and they called tenders and built the bridge in Lakefield. But during the course of this ongoing political fight between basically Harvey Township and the village of Lakefield, there was a delegation of councillors from Harvey demanded a meeting, and they came to the town hall in Lakefield and had a meeting. And I had just started working for the village, and it ended up, and they came in like this, ready to fight. And it turned out in 3 years, I went to work for the township of Harvey. Tom Flynn was the reeve, and he was one of the ones from Harvey that come in ready to fight. And he always blamed me for making that change. I never had anything to do with it. That's a true story.
Well, I'm sure that happened, but the village of Lakefield was promised a bridge long before that. Now, Harry was, he was a fair guy, that's without a doubt, a very fair man, but he was a little inclined to vote and support liberal politics. In fact, one who knew him well could say he was very, very inclined. So, the provincial member of parliament then was Keith Brown. And Keith had declared, and this is when I was on council, that he got in, Lakefield would have a new bridge. And this was long before the clenched fist from Harvey arrived on the scene. Anyway, after the election was held, Keith Brown was there, and I was always, some might say I was an instigator or so on, but I put a motion through council, and it passed, that our clerk write MPP Keith Brown and inquire as to when the bridge will be built, because it will necessary for us to make quite a few traffic adjustments in the village. And so that went through, and Keith wasn't too happy. But we did get the bridge ahead of Buckhorn.
I would very much like to thank all the panelists for their illumination of a private couple. Most of us didn't know them that well, not certainly as well as the people to my left knew them. And I have one little story, and I told this to Sheila Garrett a couple of mornings ago, and we agreed that would it were still so. My father bought a house on Nelson Street, and he went to Harry Hill to ask if he could have an addition. And Harry Hill had 2 questions for him. One, do you own the land? Father said yes. Do you own the house? Yes, said father. Do what you like then, said Harry. Common sense was still reigning. But it were still so. Mary, I'm going to ask you to give these envelopes to your committee members because I can't read the names on them.
Okay. I don't know if I can do much better.
Well, then you'll have to get help.
I will. One other thing, we do have a DVD here.
Oh, yes,
of,
we haven't seen that.
The one that was done for Eva's funeral, and I think it might be interesting to take a
We'd like
look
to see
at
that.
that.
Yes.
And this DVD was done by Colleen Allen
Yeah.
from the library in Peterborough, and Colleen was a very good neighbor and friend of Eva's, and she couldn't be here tonight.
No, she was another panelist.
We ready,
Neil, thank you.
Thank you.
very much.
Thank you, Mary.
Yes. That was wonderful.
Yes, indeed. Your mother and Helen were first.
Now, yes, before we start this video,
Harry Hill was related to the throne.
if I can have your attention for a moment. This video was done, as I said, for Eva's funeral, but the music on this that you'll hear in the background is by Albert Moher and Dan Armstrong. So you're getting an extra treat here. You're getting music as well as the picture. This is Albert's violin selection.
Thank you for the lovely music.